On June 25, 1876, General Custer's 7th Cavalry, roughly 600 men strong, charged toward a village of 7,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho along the Little Bighorn River. A warrior shouted, "The soldiers fired on us first," his voice cutting through the chaos. Within hours, 268 of Custer's men lay dead, including the golden-haired general himself, sprawled lifeless on a hill. History labels it his last stand, but that oversimplifies things. It skips the 36 warriors lost, the buffalo disappearing from the plains, and the treaties broken since gold surfaced in the Black Hills in 1874. Custer didn't just battle a people. He took on a culture he couldn't grasp. Here's the twist. He split his forces against a camp 10 times his size, betting on speed to triumph. It failed. What pushed the Lakota to fight that day? And why does this clash still resonate beyond the myths handed down? Stay tuned, because Red Horse, a Lakota eyewitness, holds the answers. Red Horse, a Lakota Sioux warrior, stood right in the thick of it, watching the battle unfold over those 2 brutal days, June 25th and 26th, 1876. His account doesn't just recount a fight. It pulls back the curtain on a clash that was about survival, not glory. The setting couldn't have been more deceptive. The Little Bighorn River wound through Montana Territory, its banks quiet and serene, a stark contrast to the storm about to break. Families had gathered there, kids playing, women tending to daily tasks, warriors keeping watch. This wasn't a war camp rigged for battle. It was a sprawling community of roughly 7,000 souls stretched along the river's edge. The water shimmered under the June sun, and the grassy plains rolled out wide, dotted with teepees. But peace was an illusion that morning. The earth underfoot told a harsher story, cracked and dry, baked hard by a sun that offered no mercy. Every gust of wind kicked up dust, swirling it into the air, stinging eyes and coating throats. It was a land that demanded resilience, and on June 25, 1876, it set the stage for a showdown that would echo through time. Red Horse saw it all coming. He wasn't some distant observer scribbling notes after the fact. He was a warrior, part of the Lakota Sioux, one of the key groups in that massive encampment. Alongside the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, they'd come together in numbers that dwarfed anything Custer expected. The U.S. history books love to frame this as the moment Custer met his doom, a heroic tragedy for a bold cavalry leader. But that's only half the picture, and it's the half that conveniently forgets who was really at stake. For Red Horse and his people, this wasn't about taking down a famous name. It was about holding on to everything they had left. The U.S. Army wasn't just a military force rolling in with guns blazing. It was the spearhead of a government that had been chipping away at their world for years. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had promised the Black Hills to the Lakota, a sacred stretch of land tied to their identity. Then gold showed up in 1874, and suddenly those promises didn't mean much. Miners flooded in, the government shrugged, and the buffalo, the heartbeat of Lakota life, started vanishing as hunters and settlers tore through the plains. By 1876, that pressure had built into a breaking point. That morning, the tension hung thick. The sky stretched wide and unforgiving, glaring down on a landscape that felt like it was holding its breath. The cracked ground crunched under moccasins as scouts raced back to the village, their faces grim. They'd spotted dust clouds rising about 12 miles off, a telltale sign of trouble closing in fast. Word spread like wildfire. Custer and his 7th Cavalry were coming, and they weren't stopping to talk. The peaceful banks of the Little Bighorn, where kids had laughed just hours before, were about to turn into a battlefield. For Red Horse, it wasn't a surprise attack that sparked the fight. It was the soldiers' first shots that shattered the calm. This wasn't Custer's story alone. It was the Lakotas, a people pushed to the edge, staring down an enemy determined to take what little they had left. By June 1876, the banks of the Little Bighorn River buzzed with life. Nearly 7,000 people had gathered there, a massive encampment of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. It wasn't just warriors. Men, women, and children filled the sprawling village, their teepees dotting the grassy plains alongside the shimmering water. Families cooked, kids darted between lodges, and the air carried the hum of a community rooted in the land. This wasn't some temporary stop. It was a stand, a coming together of tribes facing a threat that had been building for years. The river flowed steady and calm, but beneath that peace, a storm was brewing, one that would crash down hard on June 25th. The roots of that storm stretched back to promises made and broken. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty had drawn a line in the dirt, handing the Black Hills to the Lakota Sioux, a sacred chunk of earth they'd fought to keep. It was supposed to be untouchable, a guarantee from the U.S. government that this land would stay theirs. Then, in 1874, gold glittered in those hills. Prospectors swarmed in, their picks and pans tearing into the ground like it was free for the taking. The U.S. didn't just look the other way. By 1876, they'd ripped up the treaty and flung the doors wide open to miners. The Black Hills, once a lifeline, became a battleground, and the Lakota watched their world shrink with every new settler who staked a claim. That betrayal wasn't abstract. It was a gut punch to a people already reeling. Worse still, the buffalo were fading fast. For the Lakota, those massive herds weren't just food. They were everything: clothing, shelter, tools, the pulse of their culture. By the mid-1870s, the plains that once thundered with millions of hooves had gone quiet. Overhunting by settlers and deliberate U.S. policies aimed at starving out the tribes had slashed the herds to shadows of what they'd been. The buffalo's decline wasn't some natural fluke. It was a calculated blow, stripping the Lakota of their lifeblood and pushing their way of life to the brink. Every empty stretch of prairie was a reminder of what they stood to lose, not just land, but an entire existence tied to it. The encampment along the Little Bighorn wasn't just a gathering. It was a defiance, a refusal to let that loss swallow them whole. Then, at dawn on June 25, 1876, the calm shattered. Scouts tore back into the village, their breath ragged, faces tight with urgency. They'd seen it, a dust cloud rising about 12 miles off, kicked up by General George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry. Somewhere between 600 and 650 soldiers strong, they were closing in fast, their horses pounding the dry earth, their intent clear. The news hit the camp like a spark on dry grass. Warriors grabbed weapons, women hushed children, and the air thickened with the weight of what was coming. The dust on the horizon wasn't just a sign of movement. It was a warning, a promise of violence racing toward them. The Little Bighorn, so peaceful just moments before, stood on the edge of chaos, its people braced for a fight they hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. By midday on June 25, 1876, the tension along the Little Bighorn River snapped. General George Armstrong Custer had a plan, and he set it in motion fast. He split his 7th Cavalry, about 600 men total, into 3 chunks. Major Reno got orders to take around 140 soldiers and hit the southern end of the village head-on. Custer himself led a group of 210 to 225 men, aiming to swing around and strike from the north, hoping to catch the camp off guard. Captain Frederick Benteen and his roughly 120 troops were told to hang back, a reserve force ready to jump in where needed. It was a bold move, splitting up like that, banking on speed and surprise, to overwhelm a village that outnumbered them 10-1. But the land and the people there had other ideas. Red Horse, standing among the Lakota warriors, saw how it started. "The soldiers fired on us first," he later recalled, his words cutting through any notion of a peaceful encounter. Those shots rang out around noon, shattering the morning's uneasy quiet. The U.S. Army didn't roll up waving a white flag. They came in hot, guns blazing, and that first volley marked the moment the battle kicked off. For the 7,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho in the camp, it wasn't a surprise attack that sparked the fight. It was Custer's men pulling triggers. The sound of gunfire bounced off the hills, a signal that the day was about to turn bloody. Down at the southern edge of the village, Reno's assault hit hard but unraveled fast. Around 3 p.m., his 140 soldiers charged in, hooves pounding the dry earth, dust billowing behind them. They aimed to smash through the camp's defenses, expecting a quick rout. Instead, they slammed into a wall of resistance. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors poured out, meeting them with arrows, gunfire, and sheer numbers. Women and children scattered, some grabbing what they could, others just running for cover. Reno's men barely held their ground before the fight turned against them. Within an hour, they were scrambling back across the Little Bighorn River, chased by warriors who wouldn't let up. The retreat was a mess, horses slipping on the banks, men shouting over the roar of the current. By the time they reached the bluffs on the other side, 36 of Reno's soldiers were dead. A rough count from the chaos, their bodies left scattered in the grass or swept away by the water. The attack had crumbled, and Reno's survivors dug in, battered and shaken. Meanwhile, Custer pushed his own plan from the north. Leading his 210 to 225 men, he swung wide, trying to flank the village and hit it where it wasn't expecting trouble. The terrain played tricks on him, though. Hills and ravines broke up the landscape, hiding the camp's true size and the warriors waiting there. Dust kicked up by his horses hung thick in the air, clouding their view as they rode. Custer figured he could slip in, strike fast, and trap the village between his force and Reno's. But the dust didn't just blind his men, it masked the response building against him. Warriors were already moving, spotting his approach, ready to turn his clever maneuver into a fatal mistake. The Little Bighorn's peaceful banks were gone, replaced by a battlefield where every ridge and gully was about to light up with war. Red Horse watched it unfold, the soldiers' first shots still ringing in his ears, the fight now spreading like wildfire across the plains. As the afternoon of June 25, 1876, wore on, Custer's gamble started to fall apart. His big mistake was splitting the 7th Cavalry into smaller pieces. He'd carved his roughly 600 men into 3 separate units, Major Reno hitting the south, Captain Benteen holding back, and Custer himself leading 210 to 225 soldiers toward the north. It might have looked smart on paper, a way to box in the village and crush it from multiple angles. But out there on the cracked plains of the Little Bighorn, it left his battalion dangling, cut off and exposed. Facing them were an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, a force that didn't just outnumber Custer's group, it dwarfed it. The rugged land swallowed any hope of coordination between his scattered units, and that decision turned a bold strategy into a death trap. The warriors didn't waste a second. They struck fast, pouring out from every direction, some on foot, others thundering in on horseback. Red Horse later described it, plain and simple. We attacked them from all sides. They knew the terrain like their own skin, the hills, ravines, and bluffs that twisted through the valley. Those features weren't just scenery, they were weapons. Warriors used them to outflank Custer's men, slipping through gullies, popping up over ridges, hitting hard where the soldiers least expected it. The dust still hung heavy from the cavalry's charge, but it didn't slow the Lakota and their allies. They moved with purpose, cutting off escape routes, turning the open ground into a chokehold. Custer's troops, strung out and pinned down, couldn't match that speed or savvy. The soldiers' troubles piled up quick. Red Horse noticed something critical. The soldiers did not dismount. A lot of them stayed on their horses, maybe thinking they could ride out the storm or keep their edge in a cavalry fight. Big mistake. The animals panicked under the onslaught, rearing and bolting as arrows whizzed and gunfire cracked. That chaos broke their formations, leaving men exposed. Warriors zeroed in, picking off riders who couldn't shoot straight or hold their ground. A soldier on a spooked horse was a target, not a threat, and plenty met their end still in the saddle. The ones who did get off their mounts found no cover, just open dirt and a swarm of fighters closing in. Custer's plan had banked on discipline and order, but the battlefield was unraveling into a mess he couldn't control. Then there was the river. Some of Custer's men, seeing the fight turn sour, made a break for the Little Bighorn River, hoping it'd shield them or offer a way out. It didn't. The current ran swift and deep, a trap for anyone desperate enough to try crossing under fire. Red Horse saw it happen. A great many soldiers were killed in the river. Warriors pressed them hard, cutting down those who stumbled into the water. Bodies piled up, some sinking, others washing downstream, carried off by the same river that had looked so peaceful that morning. What they'd thought was an escape route turned into a graveyard, the muddy banks slick with blood and churned by fleeing boots. The warriors didn't let up, using the bluffs above to rain hell on anyone who got close to the water's edge. Custer's battalion was shrinking fast, hemmed in by the land, the river, and a force that wouldn't back off. The tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing over them, and the end was closing in. By late afternoon on June 25, 1876, the fight had pinned Custer's men to a hill, a spot later dubbed Last Stand Hill. His battalion, 210 to 225 soldiers strong, found themselves boxed in tight. Warriors swarmed from every side, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho closing the circle with no gaps left to slip through. The soldiers' lines, already shaky from the earlier chaos, started to crack wide open. Horses lay dead or thrashing, gear scattered across the slope, and the air buzzed with shouts, gunfire, and the whistle of arrows. Desperation took hold as Custer's troops scrambled to hold their ground, but the hill offered no real cover, just a high perch where they were easy targets. The warriors pressed harder, their numbers and speed overwhelming what was left of the cavalry's order. It was a brutal, messy climax, the kind where survival trumped strategy. By 6:05 p.m., it was over. Custer and every single one of his 210 to 225 men lay dead, their bodies strewn across the hill and down its sides. The official count tallied 268 U.S. deaths that day, including 40 to 50 from Reno's and Benteen's units who'd managed to dig in elsewhere but still took heavy losses. Custer's battalion got the worst of it, wiped out to the last man in that final stand. The warriors had struck with precision and fury, turning the hill into a slaughter pen. Smoke hung thick, mixing with the dust, and the gunfire faded as the last shots rang out. The Little Bighorn Valley, once alive with the sounds of battle, settled into an eerie stillness, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the rustle of the wind. Custer himself didn't escape. His body turned up right there on Last Stand Hill, sprawled among his fallen soldiers. 2 bullets had torn through him, one in the chest, another in the head, leaving no doubt he'd gone down fighting, or at least facing the end. His long yellow hair made him stand out, even in death, a stark figure against the blood-soaked grass. For the U.S. Army, he became a symbol, a golden boy lost in a blaze of glory. But on that hill, surrounded by the men he'd led into the jaws of defeat, he was just another casualty, a grim marker of a plan gone wrong. June 25, 1876, didn't just claim his life. It buried his legend under the weight of a fight he couldn't win. The warriors who'd outmaneuvered him walked away from that hill, leaving behind a scene that would haunt the Army for years. As the sun dipped low on June 25, 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn left its mark on both sides. Red Horse counted 36 warriors lost among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, a number etched in his memory from those 2 days of fighting. Historians argue over the true toll, some pegging it as low as 31, others pushing it up to 100, depending on whose records they trust. Either way, the victory came with blood, a price paid in lives that weighed heavy on the camp. Those 36, or however many fell, weren't just numbers. They were brothers, sons, and fathers, men who'd stood up to protect their people and didn't make it back. The battle might have ended with Custer's men dead on the hill, but it wasn't a clean win, not when the cost cut so deep. By evening, the noise of war had faded. The battlefield stretched out quiet, a sprawl of bodies littering the ground, soldiers and warriors alike. Red Horse looked over it all and saw no celebration, just a somber truth. "More like a graveyard than a place of victory," he said later, summing up the scene. The hill where Custer fell, the riverbanks where men drowned, the grass trampled and stained, it all felt heavy, final. The wind carried off the last echoes of gunfire, leaving behind a stillness that didn't soothe. Horses lay still, weapons glinted in the fading light, and the air hung thick with the smell of blood and dust. The living moved slow, tending to their wounded, gathering what they could, but the weight of the day pressed down hard. Back in the camp, the mood tangled up triumph with grief. Red Horse captured it plain. Our camp was filled with sorrow as well as triumph. They'd beaten back Custer's 7th Cavalry, sent a message that echoed across the plains, but the joy didn't run deep. Those 36 fallen warriors cast a shadow over the victory. Families mourned, their voices rising in wails that mixed with the crackle of fires. The ones who'd survived stood tall, proud of holding their ground, but every glance at an empty spot by the teepee or a missing face around the circle reminded them what they had lost. The fight had saved their village for now, kept their way of life breathing, yet the holes left behind ached. June 25th and 26th, 1876, handed them a win, but it was the kind that left scars, a bitter taste lingering even as they honored the brave who'd made it possible. Years after the dust settled on June 25, 1876, Red Horse picked up a pencil to tell the story his way. In 1881, he put his memories onto paper, sketching scenes from the Battle of Little Bighorn. These weren't pictures of triumph or glory. They showed lifeless soldiers sprawled across the hill, warriors fallen beside them, the ground scarred by violence. His drawings didn't cheer the victory. They laid bare the raw, ugly truth of war. Bodies twisted in the grass, weapons dropped where they fell, the river still flowing past it all. Red Horse wasn't after praise or fame. He wanted the record straight, a visual testament to what he'd seen. Those sketches stand as history, not a celebration, but a quiet, stark reminder of the cost paid by everyone caught in that fight. Even as the battlefield grew quiet, Red Horse knew the story wasn't over. "We knew the soldiers would return," he said, his words heavy with certainty. The U.S. Army didn't take defeat lightly, especially not one as stinging as Little Bighorn. By 1877, they proved him right. The victory in June 1876 had bloodied their nose, and they came back swinging harder. Campaigns ramped up across the plains, troops pouring in with fresh orders and more firepower. Custer's fall lit a fire under the military, turning a single battle into a rallying cry for revenge. Red Horse and his people braced for it, understanding that their win was a spark, not a shield. The Army's resolve stiffened, and the Lakota's defiance faced a storm they couldn't outrun forever. By mid-1877, the hammer fell. The Great Sioux War, kicked into high gear after Little Bighorn, ground down what was left of Lakota resistance. Most of them, including Red Horse's people, got pushed onto reservations, their lands carved up and swallowed by U.S. control. The victory from June 1876 bought them a moment, a fierce stand that echoed loud, but it couldn't stop the tide. The Black Hills, the Buffalo, the open plains all slipped away as the Army tightened its grip. Families who'd camped free along the Little Bighorn found themselves fenced in, their way of life boxed up on patches of earth they didn't choose. The fight had ended Custer, but it didn't end the war. Red Horse's drawings and his words linger, proof of what they'd held on to for that one day, even as the years that followed took it all apart. After the smoke cleared in 1876, folks in the U.S. couldn't stop talking about Custer. His aggressive moves split opinions down the middle. Some pointed fingers, saying he'd botched it by dividing his 7th Cavalry into 3 chunks, leaving his men scattered and vulnerable against a bigger force. Critics called it reckless, a blunder that handed the Lakota a win. Others saw it different, painting him as a gutsy hero who went down swinging, a brave soul lost to savage odds. Newspapers and saloons buzzed with the debate, picking apart his every choice. But Red Horse didn't care for that chatter. To him it was noise, missing the point entirely. He brushed off the obsession with Custer's tactics, looking past the man to what the fight really meant. For Red Horse, the stakes were crystal clear. We were fighting for our survival, he said, plain and firm. It wasn't about racking up a military trophy or proving who was tougher. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho stood up that day to shield their families, their kids playing by the river, their women keeping the camp alive. They fought for a culture tied to the buffalo and the open plains, a way of life fraying under U.S. pressure. The Black Hills, promised to them in 1868, weren't just dirt. They were sacred, a piece of their soul. This battle was about holding on to that, not chasing battlefield fame. Red Horse saw no glory in the blood spilled, just a desperate grab to keep their world from slipping away. The U.S. loved to spin a different tale. Stories grew up fast, casting Custer as a golden-haired martyr, a brave cavalryman cut down in a heroic last stand. That myth took root, polishing his defeat into something noble. Red Horse called it what it was: nonsense. He insisted the real story wasn't Custer's courage. It was about resisting an invading force that had been stomping on treaties since the ink dried on the 1868 Fort Laramie deal. Gold in the Black Hills turned promises into dust, and the Army rolled in to back it up, treaty or not. For Red Horse, those soldiers weren't defenders of honor. They were the spearhead of a government hell-bent on taking what wasn't theirs. The battle wasn't a stage for Custer's legend. It was a wall the Lakota threw up against a flood they couldn't stop. That wall didn't hold forever, but it mattered. The fight at Little Bighorn honored something bigger, a stubborn endurance that ran deep in Native American bones. It was one piece of a long, hard struggle against U.S. expansion that stretched through the 1870s and beyond. The Lakota and their allies didn't just face Custer that day. They faced a machine chewing up their land, their herds, their freedom. Every warrior who stood on that hill, every family that stayed put by the river, added to a story of grit that didn't bend easy. Red Horse's words and his sketches cut through the myths, pinning the truth down. This was about a people hanging on, not a general going out in a blaze. The bigger picture wasn't Custer's fall. It was the fight to keep standing, even as the ground kept shifting under them. The Battle of Little Bighorn, fought over June 25th and 26th, 1876, gets remembered too often as Custer's big finish. That's not the whole story. Red Horse, who stood there amid the dust and gunfire, saw it for what it really was, a Lakota stand to keep existing. It wasn't just about taking down a flashy general or winning some military bragging rights. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho put everything on the line those 2 days, battling to hold on to their families, their traditions, and the land that defined them. Custer's defeat happened, sure. His 7th Cavalry crumpled on that hill, but pinning it all on his last gasp misses the heart of it. Red Horse witnessed a people digging in, fighting not for a moment's glory, but for a lifeline against a tide that had been rising since the treaties started breaking. His voice cuts to the core of it all. "We fought for the future of our people, our culture, and the land," he said, summing up the why behind every arrow and every charge. That's the thread that runs through the chaos of Little Bighorn, a legacy that doesn't fade when the guns go quiet. They weren't after medals or headlines. They wanted their kids to grow up knowing the plains, the buffalo, the songs that had carried them for generations. The land wasn't just dirt underfoot. It was their story, their survival, and they bled for it that day. Red Horse's words stick around, a quiet echo from a battlefield that's grown still, reminding anyone who listens that the fight was bigger than one man's fall. It was about a future they refused to let slip away, a mark left on history that outlasts the graves they dug.